such a prize on offer for anyone who knows who that band and song was. Big influence on Dave Grohl, etc. Okay. Industry giants, digital censorship and control. So following up from some of the stuff I talked about at the end of the Frankfurt School lectures about the nature of the digital economy, and I've split this lecture into 3 parts. So we have 2 reasonably small videos to begin with, and then a longer one with a lot more information at the end. But I had to split it up in that way because it's quite an information intense topic, this. So really, what I'm interested in talking about in this video is the core cultural industries and how they have changed over time, and the shift from the broadcast era to the digital media era that we now exist in is very important. And because of that, we need to start talking about the core cultural industries in different ways. Traditionally, core cultural industries are referred to broadcasting, film, content aspect of the internet industry, music, print and electronic publishing, digital games, advertising and marketing. So this is from mostly from David Hesmonhal's work on the cultural industries. He's produced a textbook with several different editions now. It's really a touchstone of work in this area. In terms of critique of that, well, we already have from cultural theory the Frankfurt School critique, to take from Adorno and Horkheimer, movies and radio need no longer pretend to be art. The truth is that they're just business is made into an ideology in order to justify the rubbish they do. And that is a genuine quote, by the way, that justify the rubbish they deliberately produce. So as we know, Frankfurt School thinks that cultural industries just produce rubbish in order to sell things to morons. That's their viewpoint. All good. There is a response to that. Cultural industries could no longer be characterized simply as the other to authentic art, and both would benefit from a more neutral sociological approach as the production and circulation of symbolic forms or text. So that is O'Connor's response to this, So really what we're being asked to do here is take a more neutral viewpoint and say, look, art, culture industry, they produce symbolic texts. And symbolism is going to be very important as we go forwards when I do semiotics with you guys. But really, we should stop raging on the cultural industries. They're producing particular forms of text which are important to us. We consume them in particular ways, and we shouldn't have this distinction between the two. Really, if you think of development on the thinking of culture industries, then obviously Adorno and Horkheimer is important, and that notion of standardization, as I've already talked about, mass consumption, a particular formula for doing things, subjugation to particular ideologies. The culture industry is monolithic and standardized, and the political economy account sets up mass production against creativity and indeed as a form of control. What Hesmonhal's work does in terms of plural cultural industries is say that they are symbolic creators. There are degrees of autonomy in creation, complexity and difference. Not everything is trash. Different people make things in different ways and they're all funded. Some people are good, some people are bad. Sociocultural account looks at the structure and agencies and dynamics. So maybe some companies and some industries are very highly structured in particular ways, and they do follow that kind of model which is being put across from the political economy approach, but others perhaps are much less so, and we need to consider them in different ways. So Hesmonhal's ideas of plural cultural industries compares creative workers' levels of freedom to other industries and makes distinctions between them, and therefore the creative industries can produce artwork, and emphasizes the contested ground on which different kinds of cultural texts are produced. So maybe we shouldn't go solely with the brutal attack that Adorno and Horkheimer provide us with. Really what Hesmonhal wants us to do when we're considering the traditional industries is to think of them as systems for the management of symbolic creativity. And within those systems you could have very strong amounts of control, and you can have much weaker amounts of control. And perhaps the possibility for art in the cultural industries comes from a lessening of control or different types of control which allow people to produce in different ways. Done 5 minutes of this, and 30 seconds of that was music, and that's about all I'm going to say about the traditional models of media production. And you're going to learn a lot more about those in different modules that you do. But really, I want to focus on a couple of things that Hesmontal has to say here. The typical stages in cultural production: creation, creating the media text; reproduction, and circulation, distributing it. And what I want to do in this lecture is describe how those three stages have become collapsed in the digital media environment in which we exist in. Because contemporary digital production, which is digital, has created a class of people in society, which I'm part of, which you're part of, called the prosumer. We both consume and produce. So going back to that model, you know, where you've got these three stages, actually we're involved in all of this. We're involved in the reproduction, we're involved in the consumption, we're involved in the production of media at all times. Culture created through digital platforms and distributed across digital platforms means that these things are now crushed down into each other, and that means we have to consider industry in particular ways. Industries are now very close to the idea of platforms. We have different platforms for the production, for the distribution, and for the consumption of media text. And platforms are dominated by a few different companies. And what I want to go through is really what I call my stages of evil. Okay, because these companies embody evil in different ways, and they are all evil, but their evil is different and it's diffuse in different ways, but they all suck. And we'll just go through them one by one to see how much they do suck. So let's start. I think I'm right in saying out of the big four companies I'm going to talk about here in terms of cultural industry and contemporary cultural industry, Amazon suck the least. Apple, they suck the least. Amazon really suck. Apple probably suck the least. But they still suck. Big time. They suck, but perhaps they don't suck as much as the others. So Apple, massive multinational corporation based in California, 115,000 employees in 2015, so huge. Market value of 222 billion in May 2010. In August 11, 337. Became the world's most valuable company, overtaking ExxonMobil. In the summer of 2020, Apple's market cap was approaching, roughly speaking, 10 times what it was in May 2010. It's the most valuable company in the world, and indeed if it was a country of its own, it'd be in the top sort of 11, 12 countries on earth in terms of its gross domestic product. So that's Apple, right? I mean, stupendously wealthy company. Interestingly, Apple in the 70s when it begun in 1976 and in the 80s was a very innovative company that when it went into the 90s virtually ceased to exist, and in the 90s hit so many problems. You know, Steve Jobs left the company and so on, and the company was being really run into the ground and became very close to completely disappearing. Its launch of the iMac computers in 1998 was a big boost to Apple and sort of rediscovered its market at that point. But the thing that really propelled Apple into the dominant position that it has within contemporary consumer economics was the iPod, those little music players. And oh god, I have got one somewhere still, it still works. I can't remember where it is now. I'd show you it on the screen. 2001, the iPod comes along. MP3 player, a digital music player, for the new distribution model of music, which Apple largely came to define from that point onwards. Now, let me be absolutely clear on one point. Apple didn't invent the MP3 format, nor did it invent MP3 players. They existed before the iPod. But like most ideas Apple have in contemporary times, they stole someone else's idea, made it really shiny and nice, made it an object of desire for people to own, and they flew off the shelves. Everyone wanted an iPod. 2003, iPod and iTunes Music Store changed consumption and retail of music. They launched an online store where you could buy music. You could buy it by the album, you could buy it by the track. Things were cheap. You go straight onto your machine and you can listen to it straight away. By 2010, 275 million iPods and 10 billion songs in the iTunes Music Store had been sold. From nothing less than 10 years before, you have a multi-billion-dollar industry in music. Apple had nothing to do with music before 2001. There was nothing to do with it in their previous iterations. They became huge and everyone wanted Apple. But I was tiny compared to what they did in 2007. The iPhone literally completely transformed the smartphone market. Indeed, really the smartphone didn't exist before the iPhone. You had mobile phones that had smart elements to them, but really connectivity was poor and there was no such thing as apps before the iPhone came around. It is the most successful consumer product ever made. They made $475 billion in revenue in the first 9 years of the iPhone. That's only 9 years. We're talking it's been out for another 4 years, and that's nearly doubled in that time. So many different models, so many different capabilities, etc., etc. I haven't actually owned an iPhone in years. I switched to Android about 4 years ago, but I recognize that this is like the daddy of consumer electronics. The iPhone completely transformed the game. The reason why it transformed the game is not just because the iPhone was a desirable piece of kit, although undoubtedly was and did incredibly new things. It was because Apple created a store specifically for downloading apps, which transformed how software was distributed as a thing. There was no such thing as the App Store before the iPhone, and there was no way of getting software in this way before Apple invented it, creating an entirely new market for software. Even in the first couple of years, 5 billion apps had been downloaded. Now you can go exponential on that over the next decade. You know, this is huge. And what the App Store does is control Apple's platform. So Apple give you a phone which runs its operating system, iOS, and you can only download things from its store, the App Store. They control an ecosystem. So if you buy into Apple products, you are stuck in Apple's way of doing things. They add to that the iPad, and again, there's nothing new in the world. The idea for the iPad and the iPhone were very heavily influenced by Alan Kay's Dynabook in 1972. Basically, what you do with the iPad, and indeed to an extent with the iPhone, had been predicted back in the 70s by Alan Kay. What does Apple want? What does Apple want with all this stuff, people? This is going to be repeated over and over again. Apple wants control. Purely, Apple is about control. It's partially one of the reasons why I don't use Apple anymore, is because of the scary amounts of control that they exert over consumers when you buy into their platforms. They've basically got a vertically integrated production model, controlling hardware and software. That means their products cost more, but there's a higher quality of them and a holistic vision of how all of this ecosystem fits together. The thing I left off was the watch, of course. We're going to have that. Very soon we're going to have the Apple glasses as well, and that's something I'll come to in the last lecture of the entire module. They control design and experience. You know, they control how their operating system looks, how it works, the visuals of their machines. So in a sense, they lead technological developments, but they also shape technological development. It's no surprise over the last sort of 4 or 5 years that Windows now looks exactly almost like iOS does. Control over third-party developers, so they control App Store content. So basically, they give the yes and no as to what can be on their platform. And they control the user, making devices that limit user abilities. You can't swap out your iPhone for an Android. Believe me, it's a hell of a switch when you decide to go off Apple if you've been using it for years. It's a real drag. They want to enclose you in a particular structure. Okay, if you've got the iPhone, it makes sense to get a Mac. It makes sense to get an iPad if you want a tablet. It makes sense to get an Apple Watch if you want a smartwatch. It's deliberate. They're seamless together, but to integrate with other things, it doesn't work. And therefore you are enclosed within Apple's ecology and you have to keep buying them. And here's the kicker, all of Apple's stuff has got a 3-year lifespan. So it'll work after 3 years, but they won't give you software updates anymore. And the battery on any mobile device, and indeed on your Apple Mac as well, after 3 years just basically goes to hell. So you really got to keep on in that ecosystem, and you got to keep on buying from Apple over that time. Control. The whole development of their ecosystem is about control. Keep you locked in as an Apple consumer. You buy Apple once, you keep on buying Apple forever. You become Apple. And that's really, really important to their business model. So by creating an entire user experience across different devices, Those user experiences are consistent. You get used to it. You become habituated to using Apple. You're linked up to iTunes with an account and credit cards. You've got seamless integration and backup. iTunes now is just Apple Store, right? But basically, Apple lock you in. They lock you down to their system and they keep you in. That's evil. That's evil. But they're not the most evil. Okay, next video, I go into bigger evil. See you in a bit.